She was never supposed to be there. Naomi Carter had paid for her first-class seat, just like every other passenger in that cabin. But when she settled in, when she dared to take up space where someone like her wasn't expected, the world around her shifted. A single glance from the flight attendant was enough to make it clear this wasn't about policies. This was about power. And when Naomi refused to move, she was slapped. The entire cabin fell silent. Passengers turned away, pretending not to see. No one spoke up. No one interfered. But what the flight attendant didn't know, Naomi was the wife of the man who owned the airline. One text message. That was all it took. By the time the plane touched down, security was waiting. Careers would end. The balance of power would shift. And everyone on that flight would have to ask themselves the same question: why did we let it happen? Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from today? And if you love stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get into it. Naomi Carter had never been one for extravagance. She had built a life of quiet dignity, always aware of the delicate balance that dictated the spaces she could move through. But tonight was supposed to be different. She stepped onto Flight 417 with the kind of relief that only a weary traveler could understand. 7 months pregnant, she felt the weight of her growing child pressing against her ribs. The dull ache in her lower back, a reminder of how far she had come. How much further she still had to go. Jonathan, her husband, had insisted she fly first class. You deserve to be comfortable. Naomi, let me do this for you. She had resisted at first. Old habits die hard, but he had booked the ticket anyway. His way of making sure she was taken care of, even from across the country. The first-class cabin was quiet, insulated from the rest of the plane by a thin blue curtain. The seats were wide, cushioned, designed for those who could afford comfort. She found her seat easily, 1B, by the window. A perfect spot to settle in. She lowered herself carefully, adjusting the small pillow behind her back, exhaling slowly. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe she belonged here. Then the shadow fell over her. Ma'am, you must be in the wrong seat. Naomi looked up. The flight attendant stood rigid, her name tag gleaming under the cabin lights. Victoria Langley. Her blonde hair was pulled into a bun so tight it might have been sculpted in place. Her uniform, pristine. Her eyes, sharp as broken glass. Naomi blinked, confused, then offered a polite smile. I think there's been a misunderstanding. She reached into her bag, pulling out her ticket, holding it up as proof. I'm in 1B. Victoria didn't even glance at the ticket. First class is for premium passengers. Are you sure this is yours? The words were smooth, practiced, a razor hidden beneath silk. Naomi felt the shift in the air. It was subtle, but it was there, the expectation that she would step aside, that she would understand the unspoken rule that had just been laid before her. Her fingers curled around the armrest. I booked this seat, she said, her voice measured. Victoria let out a slow, exaggerated sigh. Did someone buy it for you? The cabin was still, but Naomi felt the eyes on her now. A few passengers had turned their heads, pretending not to listen but listening all the same. The businessman across the aisle adjusted his tie. A woman in pearls flicked her gaze toward Naomi, then away again. No one spoke. No one ever did. Naomi's breath came sharp. She had heard the question before. In different places. In different ways. Did you pay for that? Do you belong here? Are you sure you're supposed to be standing in this line? My husband booked it, she said evenly. Victoria's lips twitched at the edges. She glanced, just for a second, at Naomi's belly, then back up at her face. I'll have to check with the front desk. In the meantime, I need you to move to economy so we can complete boarding. There it was, the unspoken expectation made explicit. Naomi's pulse ticked upward. You can check, she said, her voice calm, but I'm staying in my seat. Something dark passed through Victoria's expression. A flicker of annoyance, of disbelief that Naomi wasn't bending as easily as she should. She straightened, squared her shoulders, and spoke through gritted teeth. Ma'am, I don't have time for this. If you refuse to move, I will have to call security. The tension thickened. The silence in the cabin was no longer passive but weighted, pressing down on the passengers like humidity before a storm. Naomi knew the calculus happening in their minds. Don't get involved. Don't make eye contact. Let it play out. She took a slow breath. Call whoever you need to, she said, but I'm not moving. Victoria's patience snapped. Her nostrils flared. She leaned down, Just slightly, her voice dropping to something lower. Sharper. I don't know how you got this ticket. But let's not make this difficult. You don't belong in first class. The words hit harder than the slap that came next. It was fast, sudden, a crack that echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Naomi's head snapped slightly to the side. A slow burn spread across her cheek. The businessman in the aisle seat coughed, shifting uncomfortably. A woman gasped. The older lady across from her whispered under her breath, "Oh, my God." Naomi's fingers twitched at her side. The pain was sharp, but the humiliation was worse. The weight of it, the staggering disbelief, the absolute certainty in Victoria's actions. She hadn't hesitated. She hadn't paused to wonder if she had crossed a line. Because to her, there was no line. Victoria straightened her uniform, smoothing a hand over her collar. "Now get out of this seat before I have you physically removed." Naomi inhaled through her nose. Her cheek stung. Her belly, round and full, rose and fell with measured breaths. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply reached for her phone. Her fingers moved quickly, typing a message that would set something in motion Victoria could not control. "She slapped me." She hit send. And then she waited. Across the cabin, the tension shifted. A quiet murmur spread, like the first rumblings of thunder in the distance. Some passengers exchanged nervous glances. Some looked away, but no one, not one single person, said a word. Victoria stood over her, still expecting her to fold, still expecting her to surrender. But Naomi had already done what needed to be done. A vibration against her leg told her she wouldn't have to wait long. She glanced down at the screen. A single text from Jonathan appeared. "What did you just say?" She typed quickly, fingers steady. "The flight attendant. She slapped me." The response was immediate. "What flight number?" Naomi copied the details from her ticket and sent them. And as she did, she exhaled just a little. Because now, it was out of her hands. For a moment, nothing happened. The slap had cracked through the cabin like a judge's gavel. Yet no verdict was rendered. The air was thick, heavy, charged with the weight of an unspoken truth that everyone knew but no one dared name. Naomi sat still, her breathing measured, her hand resting lightly against her cheek where Victoria Langley's palm had met her skin. No one spoke, no one moved. This was how it always happened, wasn't it? Not in the grand, sweeping gestures of history, but in moments like these, quiet, insidious, layered with expectation. A businessman in an expensive suit shifted uncomfortably in his seat, adjusting his tie as though loosening the fabric around his throat might relieve the tension in the room. The woman in pearls clutched her handbag tighter, her fingers kneading the leather, eyes darting between Naomi and Victoria but never lingering too long. An older couple across the aisle exchanged glances. Silent in their complicity, Victoria Langley stood tall, hands clasped behind her back, chin lifted like a soldier who had just won a battle. "You need to leave this seat now," she repeated, her voice smooth, controlled, calculated. Naomi exhaled slowly, letting the silence settle between them. She glanced down at her phone. 3 dots pulsed on the screen. Jonathan was already typing. Then came the reply. "Stay where you are. Do not move." She lifted her eyes, her heart steady now. "He's handling it." Victoria's expression darkened. She had expected submission, resignation. That was how this always played out, wasn't it? The confrontation, the subtle push, the inevitable retreat, the story of history written in retreat. "I said, you need to move." Naomi met her gaze. "And I said, no." A ripple of tension spread through the cabin, passengers bracing for what came next. Victoria wasn't used to this. She was used to compliance, to obedience, to people understanding the natural order of things. But Naomi, she didn't flinch. Victoria's nostrils flared. "I will call security." "Call them." Victoria hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for Naomi to see the flicker of doubt. "You need to understand something," Victoria said, her voice dropping, no longer polished for public consumption. "You are making a scene. People like you always think." "People like me?" Naomi cut in, a sharp inhale from somewhere in the cabin. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. "You know exactly what I mean." Oh, Naomi knew. She had known her entire life. She had known when she was followed through department stores as a teenager, when she was ignored at the front desk of expensive hotels, when waiters looked past her in restaurants to serve someone else first. And she knew now. She could feel it pressing in on her from every corner of the cabin, the expectation that she would let it go. That she would be the one to smooth over the discomfort in the room. But Naomi had spent a lifetime making herself smaller, quieter, more palatable, and she was tired. "You hit me," she said, the words simple, deliberate. "You put your hands on me. And now you want me to disappear so no one has to sit in this discomfort for too long." Victoria's jaw tightened. Somewhere behind them, a voice finally spoke, a low, uncertain murmur. "She's right," the older woman across the aisle said softly. "I saw it." Victoria turned sharply toward her, as if betrayal had just landed at her feet. The woman shrank back, regret flickering in her expression. But it was too late now. Victoria straightened, brushing imaginary lint from her sleeve. "Fine," she said, "if you won't move willingly, I'll have someone remove you." She turned on her heel and marched toward the front of the plane. And just like that, the whispers began. The businessman in the suit leaned slightly toward Naomi but didn't quite meet her eyes. I didn't see everything. But I hope this doesn't escalate." "Doesn't escalate?" Naomi repeated, turning her head slightly. "She put her hands on me." The man shifted. "Yeah, but, it's best not to make it worse. Best not to make it worse." It was a plea disguised as advice. "Keep the peace. Don't stir the waters. Let it go." Naomi studied him for a moment, then let out a breath, shaking her head. "You should have said something when it happened," she said. "Not now." The man had no answer for that. He only looked away. The minutes stretched along. The first-class cabin, once a sanctuary of silence, now hummed with tension. Naomi didn't move. She didn't check her phone again. She simply sat, waiting. Then the overhead speaker crackled to life. "Ms. Langley, please report to the cockpit immediately." Naomi's eyes lifted toward the front of the plane. She had a feeling Victoria Langley had just made the biggest mistake of her life. And she wasn't the only one who knew it. Across the aisle, the woman in pearls muttered under her breath. "She has no idea who she just messed with." Naomi exhaled. She wasn't sure what Jonathan had done. But she knew without a shadow of a doubt Victoria Langley was about to find out. At first, it was just a voice over the intercom. Cool, sterile, devoid of emotion. "Ms. Langley, please report to the cockpit immediately." The announcement seemed ordinary enough. Flight attendants were summoned all the time. Misplaced paperwork, protocol clarifications, passenger disputes. But this time, something was different. Victoria Langley hesitated. She had been walking with purpose, her polished heels clicking against the cabin floor, ready to summon security, ready to enforce order. But now, she stopped mid-step, her back straightening, fingers tightening at her sides. A flicker of uncertainty passed through her features. Passengers had begun to take notice. Those who had pretended not to see now watched intently, curiosity overtaking their carefully crafted indifference. They had been willing to ignore injustice, but they were far less willing to ignore a spectacle. Naomi saw it all. She remained still in her seat, her hands resting lightly over the swell of her stomach. She was not afraid, not anymore. Victoria inhaled sharply, squared her shoulders, and turned toward the front of the plane, disappearing behind the heavy curtain that separated the passengers from the command center of the aircraft. And then silence. The minutes stretched long, too long. A hush had fallen over first class, the weight of anticipation pressing down on every seat, every whisper. Naomi glanced at her phone. No new messages. She didn't need one. She knew Jonathan. He was not a man of empty words. She could picture him now standing in an office somewhere, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice level but cold. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He had built his success on the foundation of being unshakable, immovable, a force unto himself. Victoria Langley had no idea who she had laid hands on. The curtain fluttered slightly, as if disturbed by an unseen wind. Then Victoria re-emerged. She was walking faster now, her once confident stride replaced with something sharper, more urgent. Her face had lost its color. Her lips pressed thin, her hands clenched at her sides. She looked straight ahead, not making eye contact with anyone. Passengers shifted in their seats, murmuring. A man in the aisle seat leaned toward his companion and whispered, "Something's happening." Naomi remained where she was. She could feel it, the unraveling. Victoria stopped just a few feet away, inhaling deeply as if steadying herself. Then, To Naomi's quiet satisfaction, she bent slightly at the waist, lowering herself just enough so that only Naomi could hear. There's been a misunderstanding. The words were strained, unnatural on her tongue. Naomi raised an eyebrow. A misunderstanding? Victoria's jaw tightened, her teeth pressing together so hard it was a wonder they didn't crack. She exhaled through her nose. I would like to personally escort you back to your original seat in first class. There it was. The reversal. The collapse. Naomi studied her, not moving. Are you saying it was a mistake? Victoria swallowed. Yes. You mean an error in seating? Victoria hesitated just for a second too long. Naomi leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough for the words to sink deep. You didn't check my ticket. You didn't verify the seating chart. You looked at me, and you decided without any proof that I didn't belong here. That wasn't an error. That was a choice. A few murmurs rippled through the cabin. Someone coughed. Victoria's breath hitched, and for the first time, a shadow of something real passed over her features. Recognition. Shame. She was trapped. A lifetime of enforcing unspoken rules, of maintaining the illusion of control, had brought her to this moment. And now, she stood before Naomi, stripped of all her power. A man across the aisle cleared his throat. It would probably help if she actually said she was sorry. Murmurs of agreement. Victoria's spine stiffened, her nostrils flared. She had spent years in control. She had spoken with authority, dictated who sat where, decided who was worthy of comfort and who was not. She had believed herself above reproach. And now she was the one being measured, weighed, and found lacking. Naomi didn't smile. She simply waited. Victoria inhaled slowly, then forced the words out. I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter. I misjudged you, and I shouldn't have treated you that way. The apology landed like a stone dropping into still water. Naomi let it sit there, stretching the silence, making Victoria live in it. Then, finally, she gave a small nod. Good, she said. She rose from her seat with the kind of quiet authority that Victoria had once believed only belonged to her. She did not hurry. She did not look flustered. She carried herself with the kind of certainty that could not be given, only earned. And as she walked down the aisle, past the silent rows of first-class passengers who had once ignored her humiliation, she did not gloat. She simply existed. And that, more than anything, was her victory. Victoria followed behind, stiff, her hands rigid at her sides. The air around her had changed. The respect she had once commanded had evaporated. And deep down, she knew she would never get it back. The hum of the airplane engines was the only constant now. A low vibration beneath the murmurs. The stolen glances. The barely contained tension that crackled like static in the air. Naomi Carter reclaimed her seat. It should have been a simple act. A woman sitting where she was meant to sit. Where she had always had the right to be. And yet, it was more than that. She did not adjust the pillow behind her back. She did not shift, did not fidget, did not make herself small. She simply existed, and that, in itself, was an act of defiance. Victoria Langley hovered beside her, stiff and uncomfortable in the space she had once commanded with effortless authority. She was no longer dictating the moment, she was a participant in her own downfall. Trapped in the very rules she had enforced. If there's anything you need, Mrs. Carter, please don't hesitate to ask. It was meant to be a gesture of reconciliation. A desperate attempt at salvaging what little power she had left. Naomi tilted her head, studying her. You didn't offer me anything before, she said. Victoria blinked. Excuse me? When I first sat down. Naomi continued, her voice steady, deliberate. You didn't offer me water. You didn't ask if I needed anything. You didn't even greet me properly, like you did with the other first-class passengers. Victoria swallowed. Was that an error too? A few rows away, a woman in pearls let out a soft chuckle, not cruel, not mocking, but the sound of someone bearing witness to a truth too obvious to ignore. Victoria's lips parted, but no words came. Naomi let the silence stretch just long enough. I'll take a sparkling water. Victoria nodded quickly, as if relieved to have something to do, and walked off toward the galley. But Naomi knew this was far from over. At the front of the plane, Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a glass. She had been in tight spots before, an unruly passenger, a delay, a mechanical issue, but nothing like this. She was no longer the enforcer. She was the problem. She barely noticed Hannah, the younger flight attendant, watching her from the opposite counter. You really screwed up, huh? Victoria's jaw clenched. Not now, Hannah. Hannah smirked. Oh, I think now is the perfect time. Victoria exhaled sharply, pouring the drink with a hand that wasn't quite steady. You don't get it, she muttered. Oh, I get it just fine, Hannah said. I get that you thought she'd just move. That no one would say anything. That you'd get to keep playing queen of the castle, making sure first class stayed exactly how you think it should look. Victoria turned to glare at her. You don't know what you're talking about. Hannah raised an eyebrow. I know that the owner of this airline is on the phone with the captain right now. I know that security is waiting when we land. And I know, she leaned in slightly, voice dropping just enough to be cutting, that you're not walking off this plane like nothing happened. Victoria swallowed hard. She grabbed the glass of water and turned on her heel, walking briskly back toward first class. But she could feel it now. The shift. She had spent years believing she was untouchable. And now she was the one being watched. The overhead intercom crackled. Ms. Langley, please return to the cockpit immediately. Victoria stopped mid-step. Passengers exchanged glances. The tension that had been simmering now boiled over. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she turned and walked toward the front of the plane. The cockpit door shut behind her with a quiet but final click. Inside, the pilot, Captain Hughes, was seated, arms folded across his chest. Next to him, on the small screen of the in-flight phone, was a man Victoria recognized instantly: James Calloway, the airline's senior operations manager. Her stomach clenched. You assaulted a first-class passenger. Calloway's voice was calm, but his words were sharp. Would you like to explain yourself? It was a misunderstanding, Victoria started, but her voice was thinner now. Less sure. Calloway's eyes narrowed. Did you verify her ticket before demanding she move? The question landed like a blow. Victoria opened her mouth then closed it. Captain Hughes leaned forward. Did you even check the seating chart before putting your hands on her? Silence. The truth was out. Calloway's voice, when it came, was final. When this flight lands, you will report directly to the executive board. Until then, you will remain out of passenger service. Do you understand? Victoria barely nodded. And one more thing, Calloway added. Do you know who Naomi Carter's husband is? A cold wave of realization settled over her. Calloway didn't wait for her to answer. Her husband is Jonathan Carter, the owner of this airline. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. You just put your hands on the wife of the most powerful man in this company. She could barely breathe. Captain Hughes exhaled sharply. Get out of my cockpit. Victoria turned, barely able to feel her own legs beneath her, and walked back toward the galley. She didn't need to check her phone to know. She was done. Naomi sat in her seat. Calm, composed, but aware. She had felt it coming long before Victoria had. The reckoning. The seatbelt sign dinged on. The intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please remain seated and ensure your tray tables are in the upright position. Naomi's phone vibrated in her lap. Jonathan, stay seated when we land. Security is waiting at the gate. She exhaled. Passengers were still pretending not to watch her. But now, their gazes were softer, less indifferent. Some even looked guilty. The man in the aisle seat cleared his throat. I saw what happened earlier. Naomi turned her head slightly. Did you? The man shifted in his seat. Yeah, it was unfortunate. Naomi held his gaze. Unfortunate? He swallowed, rubbing his hands together. She shouldn't have treated you like that. Naomi tilted her head. And yet, she said softly, you sat there and said nothing when it happened. The man's face reddened. He had no answer. The plane touched down with a smooth but heavy impact, as if the universe itself had felt the weight of what had just transpired. The intercom buzzed again. Welcome to Los Angeles. Local time is 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated until we have reached the gate. The moment stretched, long and inevitable. Then, at the front of the plane, the cabin door opened. A uniformed security officer stepped inside. Passengers froze. The officer barely glanced around before locking eyes on one person. Ms. Langley, you need to come with us. A gasp rippled through the cabin. Victoria stiffened. Is there a problem? The officer's voice did not waver. There have been reports of an incident regarding the removal of a first-class passenger. Mr. Carter has requested a formal review. Passengers whispered. No one defended her. No one spoke in her favor. Victoria turned, for one last time, to look at Naomi. Naomi didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply watched. Because this was the moment Victoria Langley realized. She had spent years deciding who belonged. And now she was the one being removed. Victoria Langley had walked through countless airport terminals in her years of service. She had strode through concourses with the authority of someone who believed she belonged, her polished shoes clicking against the floors. Her uniform pristine, her posture rigid with the kind of confidence that came from always knowing the rules would protect her. But this time, she wasn't walking through the airport. She was being escorted. The security officer flanked her. His steps measured, deliberate. He wasn't forceful, there were no handcuffs. No physical restraint. He didn't need to be. The weight pressing down on her shoulders was far heavier than any set of chains. She felt the eyes. Passengers at the gate, airline employees passing by, even a few journalists lingering near the arrival screens. They all turned. Their gazes piercing, their whispers growing. Is that her? I heard she slapped a passenger. No, she didn't just slap her. She slapped his wife. Whose wife? Jonathan Carter's. The man owns the airline. The murmurs followed her like a shadow. Stretching long, growing darker. She kept her head high. Pride, even now, refused to let her bow. But her body betrayed her. Her hands trembled at her sides. Her breath was shallow, uneven. The uniform she had once worn with authority now felt suffocating. A woman in a crisp navy suit stood at the end of the terminal. Ava Richardson, Vice President of Customer Relations. Victoria knew her by reputation. Ruthless in professionalism, unforgiving in matters of public perception. And right now, she was staring at Victoria like she was an inconvenient stain on an otherwise immaculate carpet. Victoria stopped in front of her, her mouth dry. Ms. Langley, Ava said, her voice cool, detached. Follow me. No explanations, no pleasantries. Victoria followed. They entered a small, glass-walled conference room. The kind of room where things were decided, deals made, contracts signed, careers ended. James Calloway, the airline's senior operations manager, was already seated at the long table. A folder opened in front of him. His fingers tapped against the pages, a slow, rhythmic sound that felt like a ticking clock. A ticking bomb. Sit, he said. Victoria hesitated, then obeyed. Calloway flipped a page. Do you know why you're here? She forced herself to meet his gaze. I assume it's about what happened on the flight. Calloway exhaled sharply. What happened on the flight? He repeated. Let's break that down, shall we? He read from the report. His voice even, but the words landed like blows. You failed to verify a ticket before demanding a passenger move. You failed to follow proper protocol. You escalated the situation unnecessarily. You physically assaulted a first-class passenger. You humiliated her in front of an entire cabin. He closed the folder. And you did all of that, he said, his voice dropping to something dangerously quiet. To the wife of the man who owns this company. Silence. Victoria's mouth was dry. She started, but Calloway held up a hand. No excuses. No justifications. No misunderstandings, he said sharply. Do you know how many complaints we receive about discrimination? About flight attendants who assume certain passengers don't belong? She swallowed. Calloway shook his head. Most of the time, these things don't make it to the public. Most of the time, passengers don't have the power to fight back. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp. But this time, you picked the wrong person. Victoria looked away, her jaw tight. You have two options, Ava Richardson said, speaking for the first time. Her tone was crisp, efficient, the voice of someone used to cleaning up messes. Option 1, she continued, you resign effective immediately. No severance, no benefits. You disappear quietly. And we issue a statement saying that the airline does not tolerate misconduct. Victoria's fingers curled into fists. And option 2? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Calloway leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. We fire you, publicly. We release the footage from the cabin. We issue a formal apology, distancing ourselves from your actions. You become the face of what's wrong in the industry. His voice lowered. And I promise you no airline will ever hire you again. A cold sweat broke over her skin. For years, she had believed she was untouchable. that the uniform protected her, that the rules protected her. But now, she understood. The rules had never been designed to protect people like Naomi Carter. And they had never been designed to punish people like Victoria Langley. But today, they would. She inhaled shakily. I'll resign. Ava gave a tight nod. Good choice. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Victoria's hands trembled as she picked up the pen. The signature she scrawled felt like an obituary. The doors slid open with a mechanical hush. Victoria stepped out into the terminal. But this time, she wasn't wearing her uniform. She was just another person, lost in the crowd. She pulled her phone from her bag. The screen was flooded with news alerts. Flight attendant resigns after assaulting airline CEO's wife. Discrimination in first class. The industry reckons with its bias. Passengers speak out. We saw it. We said nothing. Her hands shook as she scrolled. Then, an email notification appeared. From Jonathan Carter. Subject: accountability. Her breath caught. She hesitated, then opened it. Ms. Langley, I assume you understand the gravity of what happened. I won't waste time repeating what's already clear. However, I believe in accountability, not just punishment. If you have anything to say to my wife, you may send it here. She doesn't have to read it, but you have to decide whether you have the courage to write it. Victoria's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She had spent years enforcing the rules. But now she had to confront the truth. The truth of who she had been. The truth of what she had done. And whether she had the courage to face it. She exhaled slowly. And then, for the first time in her life, she typed the words, I was wrong. Victoria Langley sat in her car, parked on the outskirts of the airport's employee lot, staring at the email she had just written. I was wrong. The words on the screen felt foreign, as though someone else had typed them. She had never written an apology like this before, never had to. She was supposed to be on a flight right now, cruising at 30,000 feet, dictating the unspoken rules of who belonged where. But instead, she was here stripped of her uniform, her title, her authority, facing a reality she had spent years refusing to see. Her hands clenched around the steering wheel. She wanted to tell herself that she had just made one mistake. That it was an isolated moment. A lapse in judgment. But deep down, she knew better. This wasn't just about what had happened on the plane. It was about the years before. The families she had assumed were confused when they took too long to find their seats in first class. The businessmen she had ignored, only to greet their white colleagues moments later. The woman she had once called security on, simply because she had been waiting in the priority boarding line, and Victoria hadn't believed she belonged there. It was about the choices she had made again and again. A sharp knock on the driver's side window made her jump. She turned and found Hannah, the younger flight attendant, standing there, arms crossed, watching her through the glass. Victoria hesitated, then rolled down the window. Didn't expect to see you here, Hannah said, voice casual but laced with something sharper. Victoria cleared her throat. I was just thinking. Hannah smirked. That's a first. Victoria's jaw tightened. I don't need your commentary right now. Yeah, well, I don't need to be standing in a parking lot talking to a disgraced flight attendant. Hannah shot back. But here we are. Victoria exhaled sharply. She didn't have the energy for this. Why are you here? She asked, rubbing her temple. Hannah studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. Curiosity. Mostly. Wanted to see what rock you were hiding under. Victoria scowled. I'm not hiding. Hannah gave a slow nod. Considering this. So, what's next then? Victoria blinked. Next? Yeah. Hannah leaned against the car door. You got options, right? You could go find another job. Pretend this never happened. Or you could sit in this parking lot forever, feeling sorry for yourself. Or, Victoria waited. Hannah shrugged. You could do something about it. Victoria frowned. Do something about what? Hannah laughed softly, shaking her head. Jesus, you really don't get it, do you? Victoria bristled. Get what? Hannah's smile faded. This isn't just about you. Victoria opened her mouth, ready to argue, but the words caught in her throat. She had spent the last few hours thinking about herself, her job, her reputation, her downfall, but she hadn't once thought about Naomi Carter. Naomi, who had sat there, calm and unwavering, even after being humiliated. Naomi, who had been forced to defend herself while an entire plane full of people watched in silence. Naomi, who had walked back to her seat without anyone standing up for her. And that was the real problem, wasn't it? This wasn't about one moment. This was about how many people had let it happen. Victoria looked down at her phone. At the email she had written but hadn't sent. She won't read it, she said quietly. Hannah raised an eyebrow. Maybe not. Victoria swallowed. But I still have to send it. Don't I? Hannah shrugged. That's up to you. Victoria hesitated only a second longer. Then she hit send. The lounge was quiet, save for the low hum of voices and the occasional clink of glass. Naomi sat near the window, her tea untouched, her phone resting in her lap. Jonathan was on a call nearby, his voice steady, composed, the voice of a man who had long learned how to wield power without ever raising it. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. New email. Victoria Langley. Her lips parted slightly in surprise. She hesitated, then opened it. Mrs. Carter, I was wrong. I didn't verify your ticket. I didn't follow proper protocol. I assumed something about you that I had no right to assume. I have spent the last few hours replaying what happened, and I keep asking myself why? Why did I do that? The answer is one I don't like, but I won't hide from it. It wasn't about policy. It wasn't about seeding mistakes. It was about me seeing you and deciding before anything else that you didn't belong. I can't take that moment back. I can't undo what I did. But I can promise you that I will never make that mistake again. You don't owe me your forgiveness. You don't even have to respond to this. I just wanted you to know that I see what I did. And I am ashamed of it. I am truly, deeply sorry. Victoria Langley. Naomi let the words sit there for a long time. She had seen apologies before. The kind that were defensive, full of justifications, veiled in the language of I didn't mean to. But this was different. This was someone who had been forced to sit in their own discomfort. Someone who had been stripped of the power they once held and had to look at themselves for the first time. She inhaled slowly. Then, with quiet certainty, she began to type. Ms. Langley, I appreciate your email. I am not angry anymore. But I hope you understand that this isn't just about me. There are other people who have been in my situation who never got justice. Who never had a voice. I was lucky that my husband could make things right. But not everyone has that privilege. You say you won't make this mistake again. I hope that's true. Because I'm not interested in whether or not you're sorry. I'm interested in whether or not you change. I won't meet with you. But I accept your apology. Not because you deserve it. But because I believe in growth. Naomi Carter. She hit send. Then, with a quiet sigh, she picked up her tea and took a slow sip. Closing this chapter forever. Victoria Langley sat in the dim glow of her small apartment, her phone resting on the table before her. She had read Naomi Carter's response more times than she could count. I'm not interested in whether or not you're sorry. I'm interested in whether or not you change. The words had settled inside her like a stone at the bottom of a river, sinking deeper with each passing hour. She had expected silence. She had even braced herself for outright rejection. But what Naomi had given her was something far more dangerous, a challenge. Because an apology was easy. A change in character? That was something else entirely. Victoria exhaled sharply and ran a hand over her face. The world outside her apartment felt smaller now. No uniform waiting in her closet. No schedules to check. No sense of purpose tethering her to the identity she had built for herself over the past decade. She had been somebody once. Now, she was just a woman with too much time to think. Her phone buzzed again. Another news alert. She didn't have to open it to know what it said. Her name had been dragged through every corner of the internet. Dissected and debated by people who had never met her but knew exactly who she was. Some called for her to be blacklisted from the airline industry permanently. Some sneered that she was just another casualty of so-called cancel culture. And others simply said that what had happened to her was justice. Justice. She had used that word before. Wielded it like a weapon when she believed she was enforcing it. But now, for the first time, she wondered if she had ever actually understood it. The next morning, Victoria found herself on a train heading nowhere in particular. She needed air, space, something to quiet the static in her head. The car was half empty. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks filled the silence between passengers. Each one lost in their own world. Across from her, an older black man sat reading a newspaper. His suit was slightly wrinkled. His hat tilted just so. giving him the air of someone who had lived long enough to have seen too much but still carried himself with dignity. For a while, Victoria simply watched him, his fingers flipping through the pages with practiced ease. Then, without looking up, he spoke. "You gonna ask, or just keep staring?" Victoria blinked. "Excuse me?" The man smirked, finally setting the newspaper down. "People don't look at each other anymore unless they want something. So what is it?" She hesitated. She swallowed. "I don't know." He studied her, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough." Victoria shifted uncomfortably. "Do you ever?" She trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. The man raised an eyebrow. "Do I ever what?" She exhaled. "Do you ever look back at something you did and realize too late that you were wrong?" He let out a low chuckle. "All the damn time." She glanced down at her hands. "And what do you do about it?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Depends. You talking about something small? Or something that changed the way somebody looked at the world?" Victoria hesitated. "The second one." The man nodded again, slower this time. "Then it ain't about looking back," he said. "It's about what you do with it now." Victoria clenched her jaw. "But what if no one cares what you do next?" she asked. The words sharper than she intended. "What if they've already decided who you are?" The man leaned back in his seat. "Then the question ain't about them. Is it?" His voice softened. "It's about whether you got the stomach to be better even when no one's watching." Victoria's breath caught. She didn't know why, but that answer, the simplicity of it, felt heavier than anything she had read online. Heavier than even Naomi's response. The man checked his watch and stood. "This is my stop." Victoria watched as he tucked his newspaper under his arm and adjusted his hat. "Good luck with whatever you're running from," he said, tipping his hat slightly before stepping off the train. The doors closed behind him. Victoria sat there, staring at the empty seat across from her, feeling something shift deep within her. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't regret. It was reckoning. Later that evening, Victoria sat at her kitchen table, laptop open. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She had spent the day reading, searching, clicking through articles about racial bias in the airline industry, about the passengers who had spoken up after her incident. Stories that weren't hers. Stories of people who had been removed from seats they had paid for. Of families told they must have made a mistake. Of men and women who had learned, over and over, that their presence in certain spaces would always be questioned. For years, she had believed she was simply following the rules. But what were rules if they only served to reinforce the same old systems? She took a deep breath and began to type. Not an apology, not a defense, but an acknowledgement. A recognition that what she had done, what she had been a part of, was bigger than one flight. Bigger than one woman. And that it was time to finally do something about it. Miles away, in her home, Naomi Carter sat beside her husband, her phone lighting up with a new email. She opened it, her eyes scanning the first few lines. Jonathan leaned over slightly. "What is it?" Naomi's lips pressed together. "It's from her," she said. Jonathan exhaled through his nose. "And?" Naomi didn't answer immediately. She read the words again, slower this time. Finally, she set her phone down and exhaled. She's finally asking the right questions. The first time Victoria Langley had ever stepped onto an airplane, she had been in awe. The polished interiors, the rhythmic hum of the engines, the order of it all. It had felt like a world where everything had a place. And she had found hers. But now, sitting in the audience of a conference hall in downtown Atlanta, she realized that the world she had worked so hard to belong to had never been as orderly as she had believed. The room was filled with airline professionals, executives, pilots, flight attendants. Some of them were new to the industry, fresh-faced and eager. Others were veterans, with decades of experience etched into their expressions. At the front of the room, a panel was in session. The words on the screen behind them read, "Bias in First-Class Travel, a Necessary Conversation." Victoria sat stiffly in her chair, watching as the discussion unfolded. "We have to address the unspoken rules that dictate who is welcomed in first class and who is questioned," said a woman on the panel, her voice calm but firm. "Passengers of color are disproportionately asked to show their tickets, to explain their presence, to justify their right to be where they are." A man next to her nodded. "And the worst part? This isn't always conscious. It's built into the very structure of how we see people. It's in the training, in the subtle messages we absorb without realizing it. We're taught, without being told directly, That certain faces belong in certain places. Victoria felt the words settle into her chest like a weight. She had believed she had only been following policy. But the truth was, she had never once questioned the instinct that told her Naomi Carter didn't belong. And that was the problem. She had built her career on a sense of control, on knowing where people were supposed to be. And now, for the first time, she was being asked to sit in the discomfort of knowing that she had been wrong. The Q&A session began. Attendees lined up at the microphone to ask questions, to challenge, to contribute. Victoria hesitated. She could walk out of this room and disappear. She could rebuild her life elsewhere, in another industry, far from the stain of her mistakes. Or she could stand up. Her heart pounded as she rose from her seat and stepped toward the microphone. Heads turned. Some people recognized her, some didn't. She cleared her throat. I was a senior flight attendant for over 10 years. She began, her voice steady but not unshaken. And I was one of those people who enforced those unspoken rules. A ripple moved through the crowd. Some people leaned forward, others sat back, arms crossed, watching. I didn't think of myself as biased. I thought I was just doing my job. But the truth is, I didn't question why I saw certain passengers as out of place. I didn't question why I assumed some people didn't belong. I didn't question why I thought I had the right to decide who was worthy of first class and who wasn't. She let the silence stretch. And because I didn't question it, I hurt someone. From the back of the room, a familiar figure shifted in her seat. Victoria's breath caught. Naomi Carter. She had known Naomi was involved in advocacy now. That she had begun speaking out about her experience. But she hadn't expected her to be here. Their eyes met. Victoria swallowed. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect understanding. She continued, voice quieter now. But I do know this. Change isn't just about policies or diversity training. It's about being willing to do the hard work of looking at yourself and admitting without excuse where you were wrong. She exhaled. And I was wrong. The room was silent. Then, from the panel, the woman who had spoken earlier leaned into her microphone. Thank you for saying that. A pause. But now the real work begins. Victoria nodded. She had spent years believing she had the power to control others. Now, she understood the only thing she had ever truly needed to control was herself. Later, in the hallway outside the conference room, Victoria stood by the exit, unsure if she was waiting for something or someone. Footsteps approached. She turned. Naomi stood before her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Naomi sighed, shaking her head slightly. I didn't expect to see you here. Victoria gave a small, self-deprecating smile. Neither did I. Naomi studied her, then glanced back toward the conference room. What you said in there was honest. Victoria nodded. I meant it. Naomi was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, we're going to see each other again. You know, because this work? It's not just one conversation. It's not just one event. It's a lifetime of undoing what we've been taught. Victoria exhaled. I know. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Are you ready for that? Victoria met her gaze. I don't know, she admitted. Naomi studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, she nodded. Then I guess we'll find out. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Victoria stood there, feeling the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything she thought had mattered. But for the first time, she was beginning to understand what truly did.